Well, thank you, Bob, and thank you everybody for this opportunity. I've been asked to talk about the legal side of the Wielangta campaign, which of course was a court case that began in the Federal Court, moved into the full court of the Federal Court on appeal, and then of course went to the High Court in May of this year. But in real terms, a case commenced in a court is not just about the law. That's really a framework to make a decision. It's really the prism through which we can examine in this case, the environmental issues, but the politics play a big part of it as well. It just gets played out in the courtroom. And as Bob said, this case did have its genesis a long time ago in 2003. The proceedings were commenced in the Federal Court to the, I would say, astonishment of a lot of people in the establishment in May of 2005. And I know there's a Greens function on in Hobart at the moment. Some of you might have to block your ears. I'd like to, and I don't do this very often, I'd like to read a media release from the former Minister for Fisheries, the Honourable Ian MacDonald. And as I said, I don't do this very often. This was issued the day after Bob started his case in the Federal Court. This was the Liberal Party's contribution. Described as another Green stunt, the media release says, Tasmanian Green Senator Bob Browne's latest publicity stunt is confirmation he is suffering from relevance deprivation. Unfortunately, he didn't explain that. Minister for Forestry and Conservation, Senator Ian MacDonald, said that Bob Browne's attempts to stop forest operations by a court injunction is no more than a stunt designed to give the appearance that the Greens had something to fight for. Well, can I just ask you to note that this was on the 30th of May 2008. That's 3 years ago. They still haven't cut any, 2005, thank you, they still haven't resumed logging there. Anyway, the Senator continues, under the agreement, and he's referring to another RFA that was established with Tasmania in May of 2005, under the agreement, over 1 million hectares of old-growth forest will be protected, including a new reserve in the Wielangta State Forest. He's perfectly correct. What they did is they identified every area that was on rocky ground and on mountain tops that they couldn't log, and they put that into a new reserve. He continues, the Howard government's forest policies are based on science, not the politics of convenience and facade. He says this legal injunction is an attempt to make the Greens relevant in an area where people's interest in left-wing political parties is waning, and the general public understand that the major parties are more than capable of protecting the environment for future generations. So this media release could well be put into a time capsule and buried. But I want to go back to this statement that the Howard government's forest policies are based on science, not the politics of convenience and facade. What Bob did was to take Forestry Tasmania to the Federal Court and to claim that logging of Wielangta was going to be a breach of the Commonwealth's Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act because it was going to have a significant impact on 3 listed threatened species, that is the wedge-tailed eagle, the broad-toothed stag beetle and the swift parrot. And for the first time, for many decades, Forestry Tasmania, as the respondent to this case, were on trial. This case came out of nowhere for them. They'd signed up their forest practices plan. They were ready to continue logging. They'd already clear-felled one of the coops. And all of a sudden they had to come before the Federal Court and justify the science upon which they relied to commence their logging operations, to show that their logging operations were in accordance with the Regional Forest Agreement. And that was in May 2005. And then the case proper got going in December of 2005, then had another run, another 10 days in February 2006, then another 10 days in May of 2006, and then closing arguments in August 2006, and the Federal Court, which was Justice Shane Marshall, decided on the 19th of December 2006 that Forestry Tasmania could not show that their logging was not going to have a significant impact. It was the reverse. He was satisfied that it was likely that what Forestry Tasmania were proposing was going to have a significant impact on these 3 species. And here we are in May 2008, nothing's changed. By February of 2007, the state and the federal government had amended the RFA because the case was based on a claim that the logging had to be in accordance with the Tasmanian RFA, which required the state of Tasmania to protect, amongst others, these 3 species I've talked about. That is the eagle and the parrot and the beetle. So the federal government and the state of Tasmania decided that they could get around that, and they amended this regional forest agreement so that it now reads that the state has protected these species. It's, in the words of the RFA, a done deal. So once it went to the full court of the Federal Court in August of 2007, the Federal Court were really bound by this amendment to the RFA, took a rather unsympathetic view of the way the EPBC Act had to be approached, and came to the conclusion that Forestry Tasmania's appeal had to be allowed. It then went to the High Court, and the High Court decided in May 2008 that because of the changes to the RFA, they were going to review the case by a decision of 2 judges to 1. So, by any standard, Bob's case in the Federal Court has been a landmark of landmark cases. The first time that Forestry Tasmania has had to show that its science justified what it was doing. And beyond a doubt, Forestry Tasmania failed to show that their science justified anything. And it's worth reading the judgment of Shane Marshall, which is on the internet, where he was scathing of Forestry Tasmania's manipulation of the evidence. That's not my words, that's his words. The manipulation of the evidence he described as regrettable. He described their evidence on the swift parrot as ambiguous and almost impossible to understand. He was not persuaded that the state of Tasmania had in place anything that was going to protect the beetle or the parrot or the eagle from logging operations in Wielangta. And he looked at the whole prospect of logging across Tasmania through the prism of what was going to happen in Wielangta. And his judgment is a sounding board for the failure of science, and also it's a very sad story about the way these 3 species are on a slippery slope towards extinction. So the end result of that case is that the judgment of the full court of the Federal Court stands, which is that the Regional Forest Agreement does not protect the 3 species, and that the EPBC Act, the Commonwealth legislation, does not protect the 3 species, and even further, that the Commonwealth Government now has no role in protecting these 3 species, and even worse, members of the public have no role in protecting these 3 species. I don't think that the courts have failed these 3 species. What's failed these 3 species is the legislation brought in by the Howard government, and it seems now supported by the current federal government. And I think we now can look to an era of law reform, to an era where I hope we can see changes to the EPBC Act whereby our environment protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act actually protects the environment and conserves our biodiversity. Thanks very much for listening to me.